The early hours of September 1, 1939, German forces stood ready to cross the Polish frontier. For all except veterans of the First World War, it would be their first experience of battle. Like most soldiers, they pondered in the isolation of darkness on their chances of survival and whether they would disgrace themselves. As they waited to start their engines, a panzer commander on the border of Silesia described his ghostly surroundings. The dark forest, full moon and a light ground mist provide a fantastical scene. At 4.45 hours, the first shells fired came from the sea near Danzig. The Schleswig-Holstein, a veteran of the 1916 Battle of Jutland, had moved during the pre-dawn darkness into position off the Westerplatte peninsula. It opened fire on the Polish fortress with its 280 mm main armament. A company of Kriegsmarine assault troops, who had been hidden aboard the Schleswig-Holstein, later stormed ashore but were bloodily repelled. In Danzig itself, Polish volunteers rushed to defend the central post office on the Westerplatte, but they stood little chance against the Nazi stormtroopers, SS and regular forces smuggled into the city. Almost all the Polish survivors were executed after the battle. Nazi banners appeared on public buildings, and church bells rang while priests, teachers and other prominent Poles in the city were rounded up as well as Jews. Work on the nearby Stutthof concentration camp was to be speeded up to accommodate the influx of new prisoners. Later in the war, Stutthof would supply the bodies for the experiments in the Danzig Anatomical Medical Institute to process human corpses for leather and soap. Hitler's postponement of the invasion by 6 days had given the Wehrmacht the opportunity to mobilize and deploy 21 more infantry divisions and 2 extra motorized divisions. Altogether, the German army now mustered almost 3 million men, 400,000 horses and 200,000 vehicles. 1.5 million troops had moved to the Polish frontier, many with blank cartridges on the pretext that they were on maneuvers. There was no further uncertainty about their mission once they were instructed to load ball ammunition instead. Poland's forces, in stark contrast, were not fully deployed because the British and French governments had warned Warsaw that a premature call-up might give Hitler the excuse to attack. The Poles had delayed the order for general mobilization until August 28, but then cancelled it again the next day when the British and French ambassadors urged them to hold back in the last-minute hope of negotiations. It was finally issued once more on August 30th. These changes caused chaos. Only about a third of Poland's 1.3 million badly armed soldiers were in position on September 1st. Their only hope was to resist until the French could launch their promised offensive in the west. General Maurice Gamelin, the commander-in-chief, had guaranteed on May 19 that the French army would come with the bulk of its forces no later than the 15th day after his government ordered mobilization. But time as well as geography was against the Poles. It would not take the Germans long to reach their heartland from East Prussia in the north, Pomerania and Silesia in the west, and German-dominated Slovakia in the south. Having no knowledge of the secret protocol to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Polish government did not attempt to defend its eastern frontier in strength. The idea of a double invasion coordinated between the Nazi and Soviet governments still seemed to represent a political paradox too far. At 4.50 hours on September 1st, as German troops waited for the moment of attack, they heard the roar of aircraft coming from behind. And as the waves of Stukas, Messerschmitts and Heinkels passed over their heads, they cheered in the knowledge that the Luftwaffe was about to hit Polish airfields in a preemptive strike. German soldiers had been told by their officers that the Poles would fight back with underhand tactics, using civilian sharpshooters and sabotage. Polish Jews were said to be friendly to the Bolsheviks and German haters. The Wehrmacht's plan was to invade Poland simultaneously from the north, west, and east. Its advance was to be swift and ruthless, using both armored columns and the Luftwaffe to catch the Poles before they could establish proper lines of defense. Army Group North's formations attacked from Pomerania and East Prussia. Its priorities were to link up across the Danzig corridor and advance southeastwards on Warsaw. Army Group South, commanded by Generaloberst Gerd von Rundstedt, was to advance rapidly from southern Silesia towards Warsaw on a broader front. The intention was for the two army groups to cut off the bulk of the Polish army west of the Vistula. The 10th Army, forming the center of the southern sickle, had the greatest number of motorized formations. To its right, the 14th Army would advance towards Krakow, while 3 mountain divisions, a panzer division, a motorized division and 3 Slovak divisions attacked north from the German puppet state of Slovakia. In central Berlin on the morning of the invasion, SS guards lined the Wilhelmstrasse and the Pariser Platz as Hitler made his way from the Reichschancellery to the Kroll Opera House. This is where the Reichstag sat after the notorious fire which had burned out the Parliament building less than a month after the Nazis came to power in 1933. He claimed that his reasonable demands on Poland, those which he had been careful never to present to Warsaw, had been rejected. This 16-point peace plan was published that day in a cynical attempt to demonstrate that the Warsaw government was responsible for the conflict. To great cheers, he announced the return of Danzig to the Reich. Dr. Karl Jacob Burckhardt, the League of Nations High Commissioner in the Free City, was forced to leave. In London, once certain clarifications had been obtained on the facts of the invasion, Chamberlain issued the order for general mobilization. In the course of the previous 10 days, Britain had been taking initial steps to prepare for war. Chamberlain had not wanted full mobilization because that might provoke a chain reaction in Europe, as had happened in 1914. Anti-aircraft and coastal defenses had been the first priority. Attitudes had changed dramatically as soon as news of the German invasion arrived. Nobody now could believe that Hitler was bluffing. The mood in the country and in the House of Commons was much more determined than before the Munich crisis of the previous year. The Cabinet and the Foreign Office nevertheless took most of the day to draft an ultimatum to Hitler demanding that he withdraw his troops from Poland. Yet even when finished, it did not read like a full ultimatum because it lacked a cutoff point after the French Council of Ministers had received a report from their ambassador Robert Calandra in Berlin. Daladier gave the order for full mobilization the next day. The actual word for war is not uttered in the course of the meeting, one of those present noted. It was referred to only by euphemisms. Instructions for the evacuation of children from both capitals were also issued. There was a widespread expectation that hostilities would commence with massive bombing raids. A blackout was imposed from that evening in both capitals. In Paris, news of the invasion had come as a shock, since hopes had risen over previous days that a European conflict could be avoided. Georges Bonnet, the foreign minister and most extreme appeaser of all, blamed the Poles for their stupid and obstinate attitude. He still wanted to bring in Mussolini as mediator for another Munich-style agreement. But the mobilization generale continued, with trains full of reservists pulling out of the Gare de l'Est in Paris towards Metz and Strasbourg. Not surprisingly, the Polish government in Warsaw began to fear that the Allies had once again lost their nerve. Even politicians in London suspected from the imprecise note and the lack of time limit that Chamberlain might yet try to evade the commitment to Poland. But Britain and France were following the conventional diplomatic route, almost as if to emphasize their difference to the proponent of undeclared Blitzkrieg. In Berlin, the night of September 1st remained unusually hot. Moonlight illuminated the darkened streets of the Reich capital, now under blackout in case of Polish air raids. Another form of blackout was also imposed. Goebbels introduced a law making it a serious crime to listen to a foreign radio station. Ribbentrop refused to see the British and French ambassadors together, so at 21:20 hours Henderson delivered his note demanding an immediate withdrawal of German forces from Poland. Calandra delivered the French version half an hour later. Hitler, perhaps encouraged by the unrobust phrasing of the notes, remained convinced that both their governments would still back off at the last moment. The next day, staff at the British Embassy bade farewell to their German servants, before moving into the Adlon Hotel just round the corner. A certain diplomatic limbo seemed to ensue in all three capitals. Suspicions of renewed appeasement resurfaced again in London, but the delay was due to a request from the French who said they needed more time to mobilize their reservists and evacuate civilians. Both governments were convinced of the need to act together, but Georges Bonnet and his allies still struggled to put off the fateful moment. Unfortunately, the famously indecisive Daladier allowed Bonnet to continue to foster notions of an international conference with the fascist government in Rome. Bonnet rang London to urge British support, but both Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, and Chamberlain, insisted that no discussions could take place while German troops remained on Polish territory. Halifax also rang the Italian Foreign Minister, Count Ciano, to remove any doubt on the matter. The failure to impose a time limit on the vague ultimatum had brought on a cabinet crisis in London towards the end of that afternoon. Chamberlain and Halifax explained the need to stay alongside the French, which meant that the final decision lay with them. But the skeptics, backed up by the chiefs of staff who were present, rejected this logic. They feared that, without a firm British initiative, the French would not move. Limit had to be imposed. Chamberlain was even more shaken by his reception in the House of Commons less than 3 hours later. His explanation for the delay in declaring war was heard in a hostile silence. Then, when Arthur Greenwood, acting as the Labour Party's leader, rose to reply, even staunch Conservatives were heard to call out, "Speak for England!" Greenwood made it quite clear that Chamberlain should answer to the House the very next morning. That night, as a thunderstorm raged outside, Chamberlain and Halifax summoned the French ambassador, Charles Corbin, to Downing Street. They rang Paris to speak to Daladier and Bonnet. The French government still did not wish to be hurried, even though Daladier had received full support for war credits in the Chamber des Députés a few hours earlier. The very word war was still superstitiously avoided in French official circles. Instead, euphemisms such as the obligations de la situation internationale had been used throughout the debate in the Palais Bourbon. Since Chamberlain was now convinced that his government would be brought down the next morning if a precise ultimatum was not presented, Daladier finally accepted that France could not delay any longer. He promised that his country's ultimatum would also be delivered the following day. Chamberlain then summoned the British cabinet. Shortly before midnight, a final ultimatum was drafted and agreed. It would be delivered at 9:00 hours the next day by Sir Neville Henderson in Berlin and would expire 2 hours later. On the morning of Sunday, September 3rd, Sir Neville Henderson carried out his instructions to the letter. Hitler, who had been reassured constantly by Ribbentrop that the British would back down, was clearly stunned. After the text had been read out to him, there was a long silence. Finally, he turned angrily to Ribbentrop and demanded, "What now?" Ribbentrop, an arrogant poseur whose own mother-in-law had described him as an extremely dangerous fool, had long assured Hitler that he knew exactly how the British would react. Now he was left without an answer. After Calandra had delivered France's ultimatum later, Göring said to Hitler's interpreter, "If we lose this war, may heaven have mercy on us." After the thunderstorm of the night before, the morning in London was clear and sunny. There was no reply from Berlin to the ultimatum by the time Big Ben rang 11 times. Henderson in Berlin confirmed in a telephone call that he had also heard nothing. In the Chancery, a third secretary on his staff stopped the clock at 11 and pasted a note to its glass front saying that it would not be restarted until Hitler had been defeated. At 11:15 hours, Chamberlain made his broadcast to the nation from the Cabinet Room in 10 Downing Street. All over the country, people stood up when the national anthem was played at the end. A number were in tears. The Prime Minister had spoken both simply and eloquently, but many remarked on how sad and tired he sounded. Just after his brief talk had finished, air raid sirens began their howling. People trooped down into cellars and shelters expecting waves of black aircraft overhead. But it was a false alarm and the all-clear soon sounded. A widespread and very British reaction was to put on the kettle for a cup of tea. And yet the reaction was far from universally phlegmatic, as a report by the research organization Mass Observation showed. Nearly every town of any importance was rumored to have been bombed to ruins during the early days of the war, it stated. Planes had been seen by hundreds of eyewitnesses falling in flames. Troops in 3-ton army trucks crossing the city were heard to be singing "It's a Long Way to Tipperary," which despite its jolly tune reminded people of the horrors of the First World War. London was putting on its war apparel. In Hyde Park opposite Knightsbridge Barracks, steam shovels began digging truckloads of earth to be poured into the sandbags which would shield government buildings. The King's Guard at Buckingham Palace had changed from bearskins and scarlet tunics. They now wore steel helmets and battle dress with knife-edge creases. Silver barrage balloons floated over the city, completely changing the skyline. Red pillar boxes had yellow patches of detector paint sensitive to poison gas. Windows were crisscrossed with strips of sticky paper to reduce the threat of flying glass. The crowds changed too, with many more uniforms and civilians carrying their gas masks in cardboard cartons. Railway stations were packed with evacuee children, a luggage label tied to their clothes indicating their names and addresses, clutching rag dolls and teddy bears. At night, with the blackout imposed, nothing was recognizable. Only a few drivers ventured forth very cautiously with their car headlights semi-masked. Many simply sat at home listening to the BBC on the wireless behind blackout blind. Australia and New Zealand also declared war on Germany in the course of the day. The British-controlled government of India did likewise, but without consulting any Indian political leaders. South Africa declared war 3 days later after a change of government, and Canada officially entered the war the following week. That night the British liner Athenia was sunk by the German submarine U-30. Out of the 112 lives lost, 28 were North Americans. Overlooked that day was Chamberlain's less than enthusiastic decision to bring his greatest critic into the government. Churchill's return to the Admiralty, over which he had presided at the start of the last war, prompted the First Sea Lord to signal all ships in the Royal Navy, "Winston is back." There was little celebration in Berlin when the news of Britain's declaration of war was announced. Most Germans were dazed and dejected by the news. They had counted on Hitler's run of brazen luck, believing that it would give him victory over Poland without a European conflict. Then, despite all of Bonnet's attempts to prevaricate, the French ultimatum, whose text still avoided the dreaded word war, expired at 17.00 hours. Although the prevailing attitude in France was the resigned shrug of il faut en finir, it must be got over with, the anti-militarist left seemed to agree with defeatists on the right that they did not want to die for Danzig. Even more alarmingly, some senior French officers began to convince themselves that the British had pushed them into the war. "It's to present us with a fait accompli," wrote General Paul de Villelum, the chief liaison officer with the government, "because the English fear we might go soft." 9 months later he was to bring a strongly defeatist influence to bear on the next Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud. News of the double declaration of war nevertheless produced scenes of fierce joy in Warsaw. Unaware of French doubts, cheering Poles gathered in front of the two embassies. The national anthems of the three allies were played on the wireless. A wild optimism convinced many Poles that the promised French offensive would rapidly turn the course of the war in their favor. There were, however, uglier scenes in other areas. Some Poles turned on ethnic German neighbors to exact revenge for the invasion. In the fear, anger, and chaos caused by the sudden war, ethnic Germans were attacked in a number of places. On September 3rd at Bydgoszcz, Bromberg, random firing against Poles in the streets led to a massacre in which 223 ethnic Germans died, although the official German history puts the figure at 1,000. Estimates of the total number of ethnic Germans killed throughout Poland vary from 2,000 to 13,000, but the most likely figure is around 6,000. Goebbels later inflated the total to 58,000 in an attempt to justify the German program of ethnic cleansing against the Poles. On that first day of European war, the German Fourth Army attacking from Pomerania finally secured the Danzig corridor at its broadest point. East Prussia was physically rejoined with the rest of the Reich. Leading elements of the Fourth Army also seized a bridgehead across the lower Vistula. The Third Army attacking from East Prussia pushed southeast towards the river Narew in its move to outflank Modlin and Warsaw. Army Group South, meanwhile, forced back the Lod and Krakow armies, inflicting heavy casualties. The Luftwaffe, having eliminated the bulk of the Polish Air Force, now concentrated on flying in close support to the Wehrmacht ground forces and smashing cities behind the Polish lines to block communications. German soldiers soon expressed a horror and contempt for the state of the poor Polish villages they passed through. Many seemed empty of Poles, but full of Jews. Soldiers described the villages as appallingly dirty and very backward. The reactions of German soldiers were even more intense when they saw Eastern Jews with beards and kaftans. Their physical appearance, their evasive eyes, and their ingratiatingly friendly manner as they respectfully took off their hats seemed to correspond much more closely to the caricatures of Nazi propaganda in the viciously anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer than the integrated Jewish neighbors they had come across back in the Reich. Every person, wrote a Gefreiter Lance Corporal, who was not already a ruthless enemy of the Jews, must become one here. Ordinary German soldiers, not just members of the SS, took to maltreating Jews with gusto by beatings, cutting off the beards of elders, humiliating and even raping young women, despite the Nuremberg laws against miscegenation, and setting fire to synagogues. Above all, soldiers remembered the warnings they had received about the dangers of sabotage and being shot in the back by Frankstirers. If an isolated shot was heard, suspicion often fell on any Jews around, even though partisan attacks were far more likely to have come from Poles. A number of massacres appear to have been carried out after a nervous sentry opened fire, and everyone else joined in, with German troops sometimes shooting at each other. Officers were appalled by the lack of fire discipline, but seemed powerless to stop what they called this Freischarlerpsychose, an obsessive fear of being shot at by armed civilians. They sometimes called it a Heckenschützen psychose, literally an obsession with being shot at from hedgerows. But few officers did much to stop the blind revenge exacted afterwards. Grenades would be lobbed into cellars, which was where families, rather than partisans, sheltered. Soldiers regarded this as legitimate self-defense, not a war crime. The German army's long-standing obsession with Frankstirers produced a pattern of summary executions and burned down villages. Very few units bothered to waste time with legal procedures. In their view, Poles and Jews simply did not deserve such niceties. Some formations murdered civilians more than others. The SS division Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, from which the Führer's bodyguard came, appears to have been the worst. Much of the killing, however, was carried out behind the lines by the SS Einsatzgruppen, the security police, and the Volksdeutscher Selbstschutzmilitia, ethnic German self-defense, who longed for revenge. German sources state that more than 16,000 civilians were executed during the 5-week campaign. The true figure may be much higher, as it came close to 65,000 by the end of the year. Some 10,000 Poles and Jews were massacred in gravel pits near Nissik by ethnic German militia, and another 8,000 in a wood near Karlshof. Houses and occasionally entire villages would also be torched as collective reprisals. Altogether, over 500 villages and towns were burned to the ground. In some places, the line of German advance was marked at night by the red glow on the horizon from blazing villages and farms. Soon Jews as well as Poles hid themselves when German troops arrived. This made the soldiers even more nervous, since they became convinced not only that they were being watched from cellar windows and skylights, but that unseen weapons were pointed at them. At times it almost seems as if many soldiers longed to destroy what they saw as these insalubrious and hostile villages, so that the infection they represented in their minds could not spread to neighboring Germany. This did not, however, stop them from looting at every opportunity: money, clothes, jewelry, food, and bedding. In yet another confusion of cause and effect, the hatred they encountered during their invasion somehow seemed to justify the invasion itself. The Polish army, although fighting often with desperate bravery, was severely handicapped not just by its obsolete weaponry, but above all by its lack of radios. The withdrawal of one formation could not be communicated to those on its flanks, with disastrous results. Marshal Mig Yyydz, the commander-in-chief, was already convinced that the war was lost. Even if the French were to launch their promised offensive, it would come too late. On September 4th, an increasingly confident Hitler told Goebbels that he did not fear an attack from the west. He foresaw a Kartoffelkrieg there, a stationary, potato war. The ancient university city of Krakow was taken on September 6th by the 14th Army, and the advance of Rundstedt's Army Group South continued apace as the Polish defenders stumbled in retreat. But 3 days later the Army High Command, the OKH or Oberkommando des Heers, became concerned that the Polish armies might be evading the planned encirclement west of the Vistula. 2 corps from Army Group North were therefore ordered to push further east, if necessary to the line of the River Bug and beyond to trap them on a second line. Near Danzig, the heroic Polish defenders of the Westerplatte positions, having run out of ammunition, were finally battered into submission on September 7th by Stukas and the heavy guns of the Schleswig-Holstein. The old battleship then turned north to help in the attack on the port of Gdynia, which held out until September 19th. In central Poland, resistance had hardened as the Germans came closer to the capital. A column from the 4th Panzer Division reached the edges of the city on September 10th, but was forced to make a rapid retreat. The Poles' determination to fight for Warsaw was shown by the concentration of their artillery on the east bank of the Vistula ready to fire into their own city. On September 11th, the Soviet Union withdrew its ambassador and diplomatic personnel from Warsaw, but the Poles still had little idea of the stab-in-Thieback being prepared from the east. Elsewhere, German encirclements of Polish troops using their mechanized forces had already started to produce large numbers of prisoners. On September 16th, the Germans began a massive encirclement battle 80 kilometers east of Warsaw, having trapped 2 Polish armies in the fork of the rivers Bzura and Vistula. Polish resistance was finally broken by massive Luftwaffe strikes on troop concentrations. Altogether, around 120,000 prisoners were taken. The brave Polish Air Force, with just 159 old-fashioned fighters, did not stand a chance against the sleek Messerschmitts. Any remaining Polish illusions of being saved by an Allied offensive in the west were soon dashed. General Gamelin, with the support of the French Prime Minister Daladier, refused to consider any move until the British Expeditionary Force had deployed and all his reservists were mobilized. He also argued that France needed to purchase military equipment from the United States. In any case, French army doctrine was fundamentally defensive. Gamelin, despite his promise to Poland, shied away from any idea of a major offensive, believing that the Rhine Valley and the Germans' West Wall line of defense could not be breached. The British were scarcely more aggressive. They called the West Wall the Siegfried Line, the one on which, according to their cheerful phony war song, they wanted to hang out their washing. The British felt that time was on their side, with the curious logic that a blockade of Germany was their best strategy, despite the obvious flaw that the Soviet Union could help Hitler procure whatever his war industries needed. Many British people felt ashamed at the lack of aggression shown to help the Poles. The RAF began flying over Germany, dropping propaganda leaflets, which led to jokes about Mein Kampf and the Confetti War. A bombing raid on the German naval base at Wilhelmshaven on September 4th had proved humiliatingly ineffective. Advance parties of the British Expeditionary Force landed in France the same day, and over the next 5 weeks a total of 158,000 men crossed the Channel. But there were no clashes with German forces until December. The French did little more than advance a few kilometers on to German territory near Saarbrücken. At first the Germans feared a major attack. Hitler was particularly concerned with the bulk of his army in Poland, but the very limited nature of the offensive showed that this was no more than a token gesture. The Armed Forces High Command, the OKW or Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, soon relaxed again. No troops had to be transferred. The French and British had failed in their obligations shamefully, especially since the Poles in July had already handed over to Britain and France their reconstructions of the German Enigma enciphering machine. On September 17th, Poland's martyrdom was sealed when Soviet forces crossed its long eastern frontier in line with the secret protocol signed in Moscow less than a month before. The Germans were surprised that they had not moved before, but Stalin had calculated that if he attacked too soon, the Western Allies might feel obliged to declare war on the Soviet Union as well. The Soviets claimed, with perhaps predictable cynicism, that Polish provocations had forced them to intervene to protect ethnic Belarusians and Ukrainians. In addition, the Kremlin argued that the Soviet Union was no longer bound by its non-aggression treaty with Poland because the Warsaw government had ceased to exist. The Polish government had indeed left Warsaw that very morning, but purely to escape before it was trapped by Soviet forces. Its ministers had to race for the Romanian frontier before their route was cut by Red Army units advancing from Kamenets-Podolsk in southwestern Ukraine. The traffic jams of military vehicles and civilian motor cars backed up from the border posts were immense, but eventually the defeated Poles were allowed through that night. Almost all had taken a handful of earth or a stone from the Polish side before they left. Many were in tears. Several committed suicide. The ordinary Romanian people were kind to the exiles, but the government was under pressure from Germany to hand the Poles back. Bribery saved the majority from arrest and internment, unless the officer in charge was a supporter of the fascist Iron Guard. Some Poles escaped in small groups. Larger parties organized by the Polish authorities in Bucharest shipped out of Constanza and other Black Sea ports to make their way to France. Others escaped through Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Greece, while a smaller number, who faced greater problems, made their way north into the Baltic states and then across to Sweden. On Hitler's instruction, the OKW rapidly issued orders to German formations beyond the Bug to prepare to pull back. Close cooperation between Berlin and Moscow ensured that German withdrawals from the areas allocated to the Soviet Union under the secret protocol were coordinated with the advancing Red Army formations. The first contact between the unlikely allies took place north of Brest-Litovsk, BRZE. And on September 22, the great fortress of Brest-Litovsk was handed over to the Red Army during a ceremonial parade. Unfortunately for the Soviet officers involved, this contact with German officers later made them prime targets for arrest by Beria's NKVD. Polish resistance continued as surrounded formations still tried to break out, and isolated soldiers formed irregular groups to fight on in the less accessible areas of forest, marsh, and mountain. Roads to the east were choked with refugees, using farm carts, dilapidated vehicles, and even bicycles in their attempt to escape the fighting. "The enemy always came from the air," wrote a young Polish soldier, "and even when they flew very low, they were still beyond the range of our old Mausers." The spectacle of the war rapidly became monotonous. Day after day we saw the same scenes: civilians running to save themselves from air raids, convoys dispersing, trucks or carts on fire. The smell along the road was unchanging too. It was the smell of dead horses that no one had bothered to bury, and that stank to high heaven. We moved only at night, and we learned to sleep while marching. Smoking was forbidden out of fear that the glow of a cigarette could bring down on us the all-powerful Luftwaffe. Warsaw, meanwhile, remained the chief bastion of Polish defiance. Hitler was impatient for the subjugation of the Polish capital, so the Luftwaffe began intensive bombing raids. It faced little opposition in the air, and the city lacked effective anti-aircraft defenses. On September 20th, the Luftwaffe attacked Warsaw and Modlin with 620 aircraft. And the next day, Göring ordered both the 1st and the 4th Air Fleets to mount massive attacks. The bombing continued at maximum strength. The Luftwaffe even brought in Junkers 52 transport planes to drop incendiaries, until Warsaw surrendered on October 1st. The stench from corpses buried by rubble and the bloated bodies of horses in the streets became overwhelming. Some 25,000 civilians and 6,000 soldiers had been killed in these raids. On September 28, while Warsaw was under attack, Ribbentrop flew to Moscow again and signed an additional boundary and friendship treaty, with Stalin making various alterations to the demarcation line. This allowed the Soviet Union almost all of Lithuania in return for a slight increase in German-occupied Polish territory. Ethnic Germans in Soviet-occupied territories would be transferred to Nazi areas. Stalin's regime also handed over many German communists and other political opponents. Both governments then issued a call for an end to the European war now that the Polish question had been resolved. There can be little doubt about who gained most from the two agreements which formed the Nazi-Soviet pact. Germany, threatened with a naval blockade by Britain, was now able to obtain all it needed to prosecute the war. Apart from everything supplied by the Soviet Union, including grain, oil, and manganese used in steelmaking, Stalin's government also acted as a conduit for other materials, especially rubber, which Germany could not purchase abroad. At the same time as the talks in Moscow, the Soviets began to apply pressure to the Baltic states. On September 28, A treaty of mutual assistance was imposed on Estonia. Then, over the next 2 weeks, Latvia and Lithuania were forced to sign similar treaties. Despite Stalin's personal assurance that their sovereignty would be respected, all 3 states were incorporated into the Soviet Union early the following summer, and the NKVD proceeded to deport some 25,000 undesirables. While the Nazis accepted Stalin's takeover of the Baltic states and even his seizure of Bessarabia from Romania, they found his ambitions to control the Black Sea coast and the mouth of the Danube close to the Plosti oil fields not merely provocative but threatening. Isolated Polish resistance continued well into October, but the scale of the defeat was savage. The Polish armed forces fighting the Germans are estimated to have lost 70,000 killed, 133,000 wounded and 700,000 captured. Total German casualties ran to 44,400, of whom 11,000 were fatal. The small Polish air force had been annihilated, but the Luftwaffe's losses of 560 aircraft during the campaign, mainly from crashes and ground fire, were surprisingly heavy. The available casualty estimates from the Soviet invasion are chilling. The Red Army is said to have lost 996 men killed and 2,002 wounded, while the Poles are said to have suffered 50,000 fatal casualties, without any figure for wounded. Such a disparity can perhaps only be explained by executions, and may well include the massacres perpetrated the following spring, including that of the Katy Forest. Hitler did not declare the death of the Polish state immediately. He hoped that October to encourage the British and the French to come to an agreement. The lack of an Allied offensive in the West to help the Poles made him think that the British and especially the French did not really want to continue the war. On October 5, after taking the salute at a victory parade in Warsaw with General Major Erwin Rommel beside him, he spoke to foreign journalists. "Gentlemen," he said, "you have seen the ruins of Warsaw. Let that be a warning to those statesmen in London and Paris who still think of continuing the war." The next day, he announced a peace offer in the Reichstag. But when this was rejected by both Allied governments, and once it became clear that the Soviet Union was determined to eradicate any Polish identity in its zone, Hitler finally resolved to destroy Poland completely. Poland under German occupation was divided between its general government in the center and southwest and those areas which were to be incorporated into the Reich, Danzig, West Prussia and East Prussia in the north, the Wartheland in the west and Upper Silesia in the south. A massive program of ethnic cleansing began to empty the latter Germanized areas. They were to be colonized by Volksdeutsch from the Baltic states, Romania and elsewhere in the Balkans. Polish cities were renamed. Lod was called Litzmannstadt after a German general killed near there in the First World War. Poznan returned to its Prussian name of Posen and became the capital of the Warthegau. The Catholic Church in Poland, a symbol of the country's patriotism, was relentlessly persecuted through the arrest and deportation of priests. In an attempt to eliminate Polish culture and destroy a future leadership, schools and universities were closed. Only the most basic education would be permitted, sufficient only for a helot class. The professors and staff at Krakow University were deported in November to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Polish political prisoners were sent to a former cavalry barracks at Oycim, which was renamed Auschwitz. Nazi Party officials began selecting large numbers of Poles for labor in Germany as well as young women to work as domestic servants. Hitler told the army commander-in-chief General Walther von Brauchitsch they wanted cheap slaves and to clear the rabble out of the newly acquired German territory. Blonde children who corresponded to Aryan ideals were seized and sent back to Germany for adoption. Albert Forster, the Gauleiter or regional leader of Danzig, West Prussia, however, outraged Nazi purists when he permitted a massive reclassification of Poles as ethnic Germans. For the Poles concerned, however humiliating and distasteful, this redesignation of their origins offered the only way to avoid deportation and the loss of their homes. The men, however, soon found themselves conscripted into the Wehrmacht. Hitler issued an amnesty order on October 4 to troops who had killed prisoners and civilians. They were presumed to have acted from bitterness over atrocities committed by Poles. Many officers were uneasy at what they saw as a loosening of military discipline. We have seen and witnessed wretched scenes in which German soldiers burn and plunder, murder, and loot without thinking about it, an artillery battalion commander wrote. Grown men, who without being conscious of what they were doing, and without any scruples, contravene laws and instructions and the honor of the German soldier. Generalleutnant Johannes Blaskowitz, the commander-in-chief of the 8th Army, protested vehemently at the killing of civilians by the SS and their auxiliaries, the Sicherheitspolizei, security police, and the Volksdeutscher Selbstschutz. Hitler, on hearing of his memorandum, said in a fury that, "You can't run a war on Salvation Army lines." Any other objections from the army were also dealt with in scathing terms. Yet many German officers still believed that Poland did not deserve to exist. Hardly any had objected to the invasion on moral grounds. As former members of the Freikorps in the violent chaos which followed the First World War, some of the older officers had been involved in bitter fighting against the Poles in frontier battles, especially in Silesia. In a number of ways, the Polish campaign and its aftermath became a trial run for Hitler's subsequent Rassenkrieg, or race war against the Soviet Union. Some 45,000 Polish and Jewish civilians were shot, mainly by ordinary German soldiers. The SS Einsatzgruppen machine-gunned the inmates of mental asylums. An Einsatzgruppe had been allocated to the rear area of each army, under the codename Operation Tannenberg, to capture and even kill aristocrats, judges, prominent journalists, professors, and any other person who might provide some form of leadership for a Polish resistance movement in the future. On September 19, SS Obergruppenführer Heydrich told General der Artillerie Franz Halder, the Army Chief of Staff, quite openly that there would be a clear-out: Jews, intelligentsia, priesthood, aristocracy. At first the terror was chaotic, especially that carried out by the ethnic German militia, but towards the end of the year it became more coherent and directed. Although Hitler never wavered in his hatred of the Jews, the industrial genocide which began in 1942 had not always been part of his plan. He exulted in his obsessive anti-Semitism and established the Nazi mindset that Europe had to be cleansed of all Jewish influence. But his plans before the war had not included a murderous annihilation. They had concentrated on creating an unbearable oppression which would force Jews to emigrate. Nazi policy on the Jewish question had fluctuated. In fact, the very term policy is misleading when one considers the institutional disorder of the Third Reich. Hitler's dismissive attitude towards administration permitted an extraordinary proliferation of competing departments and ministries. Their rivalries, especially those between the Gauleiters and other Nazi Party officials, the SS, and the army, produced an astonishingly wasteful lack of cohesion which was totally at variance with the regime's image of ruthless efficiency. Seizing on a random comment from the Führer, or trying to second-guess his wishes, competitors for his favor would initiate programs without consulting other interested organizations. On September 21, 1939, Heydrich issued an order laying down preliminary measures for dealing with Poland's Jewish population, which, at about 3.5 million before the invasion, had represented 10% of the population, the highest proportion in Europe. The Soviet zone held about 1.5 million, a figure which was increased by the 350,000 Jews who had fled eastwards in front of the German armies. Heydrich ordered that those who still remained on German territory were to be concentrated in larger cities with good rail links. A massive movement of population was envisaged. On October 30th, Himmler gave instructions that all Jews in the Warthegau were to be forcibly transported to the general government. Their houses would then be given to Volksdeutsch settlers, who had never lived within the borders of the Reich and whose spoken German was often said to be incomprehensible. Hans Frank, the overbearing and corrupt Nazi bully who ran the general government for his own profit from the royal castle in Krakow, was angry when told to prepare for the reception of several 100,000 Jews as well as displaced Poles. No plan had been made to house or feed the victims of this forced migration, and nobody had thought what to do with them. In theory, those Jews fit enough would be used for forced labor. The rest would be confined in temporary ghettos in the larger cities until they could be resettled. Jews trapped in the ghettos, deprived of money and with little food, were in many cases left to die of starvation and disease. Although not yet a program of outright annihilation, It represented an important step in that direction. And as the difficulties of resettling Jews in an as yet undesignated colony proved greater than imagined, the idea soon began to grow that killing them might be easier than moving them around. While the looting, killing, and chaotic conditions in Nazi-occupied areas made life appalling, it was scarcely better for Poles on the Soviet side of the new internal frontier. Stalin's hatred of Poland went back to the Soviet-Polish War and the defeat of the Red Army at the Battle of Warsaw in 1920, which the Poles referred to as the miracle on the Vistula. Stalin had been strongly criticized for his part in the failure of the 1st Cavalry Army to support the forces of Marshal M.N. Tukhachevsky, whom he had executed on false charges in 1937 at the start of his purge of the Red Army. During the 1930s, the NKVD targeted as spies the large number of Poles in the Soviet Union, mostly communist. Nikolai Yezhov, the head of the NKVD during the Great Terror, became obsessed with imagined Polish conspiracies. Poles in the NKVD were purged, and in Order 00485 of August 11, 1937 Poles were implicitly defined as enemies of the state. When Yezhov reported after the first 20 days of arrests, torture, and executions, Stalin praised his work. "Very good. Keep on digging up and cleaning out this Polish filth. Eliminate it in the interests of the Soviet Union." In the anti-Polish drive during the Great Terror, 143,810 people were arrested for espionage and 111,091 executed. Poles were about 40 times more likely to be executed during this period than other Soviet citizens. Under the Treaty of Riga in 1921, which had ended the Soviet-Polish War, victorious Poland had incorporated western parts of Belorussia and Ukraine. It then settled them with many of Marshal Józef Piłsudski's legionaries. But following the Red Army's invasion in the autumn of 1939, more than 5 million Poles found themselves under Soviet rule, which treated Polish patriotism as counter-revolutionary by definition. The NKVD arrested 109,400 people, most of whom were sent to the labor camps of the Gulag, while 8,513 of them were executed. The Soviet authorities targeted all those who might play a role in keeping Polish nationalism alive, including landowners, lawyers, teachers, priests, journalists, and officers. It was a deliberate policy of class warfare and national decapitation. Eastern Poland, occupied by the Red Army, was to be split and incorporated into the Soviet Union, the northern region becoming part of Belorussia and the southern joined to Ukraine. Mass deportations to Siberia or Central Asia began on February 10, 1940. The NKVD rifle regiments rounded up 139,794 Polish civilians in temperatures below 30 degrees centigrade. The first wave of families selected were roused by shouts and the banging of rifle butts on their door. Red Army soldiers or Ukrainian militia, under the command of an NKVD officer, would barge in and point their guns, yelling threats. Beds were overturned and cupboards searched, allegedly for hidden weapons. "You are Polish elite," the NKVD man told the Adamczyk family. "You are Polish lords and masters. You are enemies of the people." A more frequent formula of the NKVD was "once a Pole, always a kulak," the Soviet term of abuse for a rich and reactionary peasant. Families were given little time to prepare for the terrible journey, abandoning their homes and farms for good. Most felt paralyzed by the prospect. Fathers and sons were forced to kneel facing the wall, while the womenfolk were allowed to gather possessions, such as a sewing machine to earn money wherever they were taken, cooking utensils, bedding, family photographs, a child's rag doll, and schoolbooks. Some Soviet soldiers were clearly embarrassed by their task and murmured apologies. A few families were allowed to milk their cow before they left or to kill some chickens or a piglet as food for the 3-week journey in cattle wagons. Everything else had to be left behind. The Polish diaspora had begun.